Welcome to this webinar introducing the Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition methodology for deforestation and conversion-free palm oil, brought to you by the Forest Positive Coalition with support from ProForest. The objectives of this webinar are for key users to learn more about the Coalition's deforestation and conversion-free sourcing methodology for palm oil, and also to improve key users' ability to support Coalition members with their DCF reporting. Begin with some brief background of the Forest Positive Coalition commitments, action, and accountability before a deep dive into the DCF methodologies. The Forest Positive Coalition is composed of 22 leading manufacturers and retailers committed to driving collective transformative change to remove deforestation, forest conversion, and degradation from key commodity supply chains. In this work, the Coalition is supported by the Tropical Forest Alliance and ProForest. To deliver this forest-positive ambition, the Coalition has a three-pronged approach across own sourced volumes, working with suppliers, and addressing systemic issues in production landscapes through collaborative approaches. These actions are underpinned by transparency and accountability. The theory of change is operationalized by roadmaps for the 4 Coalition commodities, which are cattle-derived products, palm oil, soy, and pulp paper and fiber-based packaging. These roadmaps each have 5 elements of the forest positive approach, which are managing own supply chains, working with suppliers, monitoring the production base, engaging in production landscapes, and transparency and accountability. For each of these 5 elements, the roadmap specifies individual member and collective company commitments, actions, and KPIs, on which the Coalition companies publicly report on an annual basis. To support the implementation of the roadmaps, the Coalition has published a series of resources, which include roadmap implementation guidance, guidance for suppliers who would like to know more about how to become forest-positive businesses, and also a palm oil monitoring and response framework. These are all readily available on the Consumer Goods Forum website. Next, we'll deep dive into the 2 roadmap elements most linked to the topic of this webinar, which is deforestation and conversion-free methodologies. Element 1 of each of the 4 commodity roadmaps covers members' own supply chain and volume sourcing, which includes a commitment to be deforestation and conversion-free across commodity business. For this commitment, there's a corresponding KPI to track progress to DCF using an aligned methodology and understanding of commodity scope. This KPI is reported on each year by member companies through the Coalition's annual report. DCF for own volumes is not enough for sectoral transformation. Therefore, element 2 of each roadmap covers expectations for member suppliers to be forest positive across the supplier's commodity business, not just for volume support sourced by the Coalition companies. Through the roadmaps, the companies are committed to communicating and implementing the forest positive approach with suppliers, including through collaboration to address shared sectoral challenges. As with element 1, there's also a KPI for members to report on this supplier engagement. Next, we will understand the cross-commodity DCF methodology, which forms the basis for each of the commodity-specific methodologies.
Talking about how this was developed and also some of the underlying principles. So first, to note, the methodology was developed with the Coalition, but also in consultation with key partners. This includes the Accountability Framework Initiative, CDP, and also TRACE. One of the core principles in the development of the methodology was in achieving alignment and an aligned approach to DCF that allows companies to report in a way that is both consistent but also credible across the Coalition, but also with the wider sector. And the intention is that by socializing the methodology, there is wider uptake of this methodology kind of beyond the Coalition across the sector too. It's also important to note that there is a commitment to transparency in the Coalition, including reporting on DCF. And the intention is that Coalition suppliers are also able to uptake these same principles in terms of public reporting and transparency. So moving on to the basic principles of the generic DCF methodology. First, we're going to talk through the key steps that build up the methodology and the several different implementation options and what this means for different kinds of businesses. So first, we have these 3 key steps within the methodology. The first being able to trace back to a production unit at a scale needed to confirm the status. So this depends on the context that we're talking about. And we'll talk about those commodity-specific components as we go through the methodology. Secondly, confirming that there's been no deforestation after the cutoff date. And finally, being able to monitor the remaining vegetation and also effectively respond to any new deforestation or conversion in the future. So there's several different ways of implementing those 3 steps through different implementation options, which we'll now walk through. So the first implementation option A, is through certification under an acceptable scheme and chain of custody. Within certification, this includes those 3 steps that we just walked through. So there's a stage at which there's traceability, there's a certifier on the ground who can verify where the volumes came from. There's then also these stages of monitoring and checking that information. Implementation option B includes area level monitoring. This has also been referred to as negligible risk in the sector, though generally the sectoral aligned language that we use is area level monitoring. This relates to geographic areas at different scales depending on the commodity context, where there is little to no deforestation or conversion. And so a specific geographic area can be considered negligible risk or minimal risk. Implementation option C includes remote monitoring. So this might be through remote monitoring platforms where you have traceability and you can check that there's been no deforestation or conversion in that area. And finally, as opposed to remote monitoring, this could also be done through an on-the-ground field assessment. It's important to note out that these different implementation options may be more or less used depending on the commodity context, and that's something that we will be going through as you go through the material. These implementation options are most relevant for upstream companies or companies where there's good access to robust traceability information. In a context where there's limited traceability information to a production area, a company, particularly those further downstream, might be more reliant on their suppliers in being able to access this information about the deforestation and conversion-free status of their volumes. In that case, we might talk about implementation options E. So this is where you check that your supplier has an effective DCF control mechanism. And all that really means is that you're ensuring that your supplier is implementing a combination of A, B, C, or D that is effectively addressing deforestation and conversion and the risks associated with that in the supply chain. So we're now going to be walking through the commodity-specific interpretations of this generic methodology. These have been adapted for each of the 4 forest-positive coalition commodities: palm oil, soy, pulp paper and fibre-based packaging, and cattle-derived products. And all of these methodologies build off the fundamental principles which have been presented in that generic DCF methodology. The Forest Positive Coalition's DCF methodology for palm oil. First, it's important to note that as with all of the commodity-specific DCF methodologies, the palm oil methodology builds off the generic DCF methodology. So you can see here the key generic principles of tracing back to production unit, confirming no deforestation after a cutoff date, and monitoring remaining vegetation, and the several different ways and implementation options that a company might use to do this and demonstrate this. In the context of palm oil, when we're talking about cutoff dates, the coalition is generally seeking alignment with sectoral guidance. So that may be RSPO or the Implementation Reporting Framework. And generally where material is uncertified, we would recommend 2015 as a cutoff date to use. As you will have noticed, one of the first key steps within the DCF methodology is being able to trace back to a production area at a scale needed. Traceability systems and building them can be incredibly resource intensive for companies, and so it's important to understand that we're aiming to gain traceability data at a granularity that's useful and suitable to be able to manage and mitigate risk. Generally, in the palm oil industry, having traceability to mill is quite standard. Companies may then be working to achieve traceability to plantation or to fresh fruit bunch. However, this can be more challenging, particularly in a context of where you may have smallholder volumes, where there are potentially limited resources or several different intermediaries or dealers, which add complexity to the supply chain and therefore limitations in accessing traceability information. We can also think in the context of palm, the different types of production areas and how this impacts traceability data. For example, for directly managed concessions, generally these areas of production are connected to a mill, maybe the mill's own plantations, and so it's fairly easy to collect and gather geolocation information to plot, and this is often publicly available or available through monitoring platforms. We then have independent plantations, which don't necessarily belong to a specific mill group, and plantations may vary in size, but they tend to be bigger than a smallholder farm. For this, the geolocation information is generally publicly available or available through, again, a private monitoring platform. However, information on traceability to plantation needs to be provided by the mill. Finally, we then have independent smallholder producers. There are several different definitions for independent smallholder producers, particularly with specific national definitions. However, we're generally talking about areas of less than 50 hectares of planted palm oil. In this case, there's often limited geolocation available data, and it's very challenging to trace back to the plot. And so a company might be looking at traceability to a larger area where we can identify the risk level. And it's key here to consider about thinking about avoiding supply chain exclusion of smallholders. And we'll talk about this later in the context of available tools to avoid smallholder exclusion within the palm oil context. So first, we're going to walk through the different implementation options and also think about the kind of information that a company might be gathering in relation to this. We'll start first with implementation option A. So we're talking about certification. This is frequently used, not just in DCF reporting, but also more broadly for companies' sustainability commitments. And certification schemes, when assessed, it would be key to consider aligned cutoff dates and also the definitions that are used around deforestation and monitoring, as well as an adequate chain of custody. It's important to be able to trace back to the certified area, and if there is mixing, so for example, for a chain of custody system such as mass balance, it's important to be able to have additional controls to ensure that that non-certified material that gets mixed in with the certified material is deforestation free. So we'll now run through the main certification schemes that are used in the context of palm oil. Firstly, for RSPO and for ISCC, for the identity preserved and segregated volumes, both of these do deliver on DCF. For mass balance volumes, the certified component would be considered DCF. However, it's important to think about the controls that can be put in place on the uncertified volumes that are mixed in. And that's something that we'll come to discuss a little later in context of the different tools that can be used as a control system. For example, using an IRF profile. We then have MSPO and ISPO, so the different national certification schemes in Indonesia and Malaysia. While those don't currently fully address deforestation and conversion free for palm oil, they're really important in supporting and mitigating deforestation related risks and are important to consider for engagement in the future. In terms of the type of information that a buyer might be requesting from their supplier in relation to certified material, there may be confirmation that a supplier is RSPO certified, for example, through an ACOP report or a membership number, and there may be a certification claim on the invoice. So this would highlight the type of chain of custody, the scheme, and also the percentage that's certified, along with a certificate number. We can then move to area level monitoring. So again, this is an area where we're talking about minimal to no risk. In the context of palm, it's very challenging to identify areas with minimal to no risk of deforestation at large regional areas. Instead, area level monitoring is more relevant when we're talking about smaller, more granular subnational scales. For example, looking at a village level of minimal to no risk of deforestation in those geographies. This is incredibly important in the context of smallholder production. It's very challenging to map and monitor all the land, and this is often technically resource intensive for smallholders. And so that can lead to a gap in traceability information for downstream companies when considering their smallholder volumes. As an interim approach, companies can consider and identify landscapes where we can see that there might be higher smallholder-driven deforestation, or landscapes where the conversion to palm oil was long before the cutoff date of 2015. And using tools and approaches like this to identify where there is smallholder-driven deforestation and where there isn't can be a mechanism to avoid excluding smallholders from the supply chain just because there is a lack of proof. And that lack of proof is simply because of a lack of resources from those smallholders. So this also can support ensuring that there are less negative consequences to livelihoods as a result of exclusion. There are several available resources regarding looking at area level monitoring in the context of palm. One of them being the minimal smallholder deforestation layer. This was developed by the Palm Oil Collaboration Group, in particular the subgroup Production and Protection Beyond Concessions, looking at smallholder volumes. And this can be used to cross-check if independent smallholder volumes are coming from areas with minimal deforestation risk, and can then be used to also answer certain questions within the IRF version 6. And again, this tool was developed by the sector and currently covers villages in Indonesia and also in Malaysia. In terms of the information then that a FBC company might be requesting from a supplier, first, we can think about the traceability information that's available. So with the intention that a supplier's traceability definition is equivalent to the buyer and also aligned with the palm sector more generally. We would expect to see the supplier reporting on the percentage that's traceable to a production area on an annual basis, and also a clear public definition of traceability to plantation or production, and also that methodology, and ensuring that all of that reporting covers the relevant palm oil products sourced, so the full scope of volumes. The type of evidence that you might find to demonstrate that might include kind of public reporting or an internal document that details this traceability definition and also the methodology. It's important to think about when a supplier is sourcing from independent smallholders, it is more challenging to achieve this traceability to production area. So therefore, the minimal smallholder deforestation layer or an alternative resource can be leveraged by different companies to be able to identify which volumes can be claimed as DCF. Finally, a buyer may request an independent audit to look at the internal system that a supplier has, looking at kind of verification of traceability data, and where there isn't traceability data available, this might be a point at which a buyer would seek to engage with their supplier to support gaining further visibility on traceability. Moving on then to options, implementation options C and D relating to remote and field assessment. Field assessment of production areas is generally not frequently used in the palm oil sector, but may form part of a certification or auditing process. However, remote assessment to production area is frequently used within the sector, and there are many different remote monitoring platforms out there that are used, including Satelligence, Earthqualizer, and also Starling. Many of these having a tool to be able to use company traceability information to define DCF. It's important to note that the Coalition also has a key resource that's publicly available, the Monitoring and Response Framework. And this resource is key to be able to support companies in identifying when a deforestation alert that might be detected by remote monitoring becomes a grievance, and also how a company should be following up and responding to these, including some interim guidance regarding remediation where relevant. In terms of the information that a company might be requesting from their supplier regarding remote assessment, when we're talking about traceability information, you can look back at the slide that was covered regarding area level monitoring. In terms of remote monitoring, though, a buyer is likely to request information regarding the supplier's system of remote monitoring and the assurance mechanism that they use. So we would aim to have a transparent deforestation monitoring system that aligns with the FBC palm oil DCF methodology. And some of the key components that it would include is, one, a definition of forest and other kinds of ecosystems, including the kind of information that's gathered regarding this. It's important to also understand how a supplier is quantifying the amount of natural vegetation that existed before the cutoff date, being able to then estimate how much has been converted, and explain how volumes are linked to this assessment of deforestation and conversion free. Suppliers may also be monitoring grievances and remediation associated with that. And this is where the Deforestation Monitoring and Response Framework is a key resource that's available for companies to use. In terms of the type of evidence that might be requested or might be shown, this could include deforestation alerts. This could include using a remote monitoring sensing of deforestation provider, and this could also include a log of deforestation related grievances. Moving on then to the kind of information that an FBC company might be requesting from suppliers. Again, please refer to one of the previous slides for some of that additional information regarding traceability information. Again, a buyer may request the supply system to be transparent and want to understand the insurance mechanisms and methodologies in place. Field assessments are not as commonly used as an implementation option for DCF. However, you can see here listed some of the types of information that could be requested. In terms of the evidence that can demonstrate this implementation option, this could include an environmental risk assessment report, including a summary of the methodology and the results from that assessment. Moving on to implementation option E, the supplier DCF system or control. Again, this is most relevant for companies who are downstream and have limited access to traceability, to production area information. So as you've seen, we've walked through implementation options A, B, C, and D in the previous slides. However, implementation option E is ensuring that a supplier has implemented A to D in an effective way that manages deforestation and conversion free for palm oil. So these steps might include checking a supplier's assurance system, that they're operating an acceptable combination of A to D, and also defining the methodology or criteria to be able to approve a supplier in terms of the methodology. Once a company has defined that a supplier has a credible DCF system in place, there are then the volumes that would be considered DCF, and there are then also the non-DCF volumes from that supplier. So the DCF volumes can then fall under the DCF category. For non-DCF volumes, we'll be covering that in a moment in terms of the kinds of steps and efforts that a company might take to address those volumes. One of the available tools and approaches that a company may use regarding a supplier DCF control system is the NDPE IRF. That's a tool that is used for monitoring and reporting across a full supply base of a company at any stage in the supply chain. And the volumes under the delivering category of the version 6 of the IRF can be classified as DCF. And we'll walk through what that means in a moment. So the kind of information that a FBC company might be requesting from their supplier. First, a company might request transparency on the kinds of pathways or implementation options that a supplier is using, including the methodology and the assurance mechanisms that they have in place. If a supplier is using the IRF to be able to track their progress, the following criteria might be useful to check from the context of a buyer. So first, we would hope that a supplier is publishing their deforestation and peat refinery profiles, has targets for the results from the IRF, and it's important to consider that we're talking about the percentage that falls into the delivering category as being DCF. It's also good practice to verify the IRF results against the data verification protocol. And finally, as the IRF is currently in transition of 5.8 to version 6, we would hope to see a supplier is committed to that transition from the versions. If a supplier isn't using the IRF, the buyer can assess the level of methodological alignment based on the methodology that a supplier is using across options A to D. And the kind of evidence that a buyer might be using to look at this information from a supplier is something like public reporting on DCF and also an assurance statement from a third-party verifier. We can now run through an example of using implementation option E in the context of a supplier with an NDPE IRF profile, which is this overarching reporting tool. So first, the IRF and the purpose of the IRF. It was developed by the Palm Oil Collaboration Group, which is a sectoral collaborative space, with the intention of supporting companies in tracking and reporting on the progress that they're making against their NDP commitments across their full production base. The IRF profiles can then aggregate information on no deforestation and peat commitment performance across the supply base, and allocate volumes within these different categories, with the delivering category being the end goal regarding DCF. The IRF gathers information through existing tools and approaches regarding meeting deforestation-free commitments, including certification, satellite monitoring, responses to deforestation alerts and grievances, and other on-the-ground actions regarding addressing deforestation and peatland. And there are several available public resources regarding the IRF available on their website, but also the resources page at the end of this deck. Finally, the link to DCF reporting. So the IRF covers both deforestation and peat expansion, and the IRF version 6, which is the newest version, can provide an aggregated profile which captures all the information that's needed for deforestation, as opposed to the two separate profiles in the previous version. Version 6 of the IRF, the delivering category, aligns with the FBC DCF methodology. And while many companies are still reporting with the IRF version 5.8 to report on 2024 volumes, from 2026 onward, so talking about 2025 volumes, only the IRF version 6 will be available for reporting. Moving on then to verification, which is something that many companies may use, particularly in the context of their public reporting. Within the context of the Forest Positive Coalition, verification is considered to be good practice, but it's not a requirement for reporting on DCF. However, we do encourage companies to be transparent and to state if reporting data is either self-declared or has been verified. And in the context of verification, we are talking about verification by a third party. There's several different resources available regarding verification. First, under the Palm Oil Collaboration Group, there's currently some independent verification guidance that's being developed and protocol associated with this. This group includes several key stakeholders in the sector. There is also a data verification protocol for data that gets reported through the IRF tool. And there are several certification bodies who are trained to be able to undertake that protocol. And finally, the Accountability Framework Initiative is also currently developing guidance on when to use verification and the different contexts that this might relate to for reporting. So now we're going to talk about, finally, the types of steps and actions that a company might take for the volumes that don't fall under the DCF category. First, within a company's own supply chain, companies can work with their suppliers to manage deforestation risks. And where there aren't DCF approaches available, it's really key to have engagement and to collaborate to be able to mitigate those risks. This fits into kind of the DCF supplier strategy within the coalition's theory of change. There's also opportunities to work beyond supply chains and beyond just companies' own suppliers, to also consider engagement in production landscapes and opportunities to work collectively. And this can fall under element 4 of the Palm Oil Roadmap from the coalition, and you can find some available links there. In the context of palm, this is also incredibly relevant because it's a mechanism to support independent smallholders in production landscapes in their ability to achieve DCF, but also in avoiding their exclusion from supply chains. And so you can see here the kind of cycle in which a company might be taking to engage their suppliers and the conversation that they may have around DCF, to have this review cycle to identify and prioritize efforts and investments towards a no deforestation commitment. Finally, we'd like to highlight that there are some available resources regarding palm oil beyond the palm oil DCF methodology that is linked earlier in the deck. The Forest Positive Coalition Palm Oil Roadmap has several available resources. There is also some guidance for forest positive suppliers in the context of palm oil. There's the monitoring and response framework, and also further information about the implementation reporting framework.